The concept of the City Club's premier issue, rebuilding community, was defined earlier this year by a club task force as, quote, achieving an equilibrium where people of widely different viewpoints can and do work together to keep this community healthy and functional, unquote. A laudable goal, but achieving it will mean assuring that diverse views indeed are coming together in our organization, in the City Club, and in others in the community. And it will be important, too, that the diversity that emerges is clearly evident in the community fabric that's woven from the discussion and debates of the issues. Not just talk then, but results and outcomes. In a city of largely Caucasian demographics, this becomes especially important about views held by people of color. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Nancy Denton of the State University of New York, will help us and no doubt challenge us as we consider what must be done to truly achieve a healthy and functional community. Her subject is American Apartheid, Segregation, and the Making of the Underclass. This is also the title of her book, co-authored with Douglas Massey, which won a 1994 award from the American Sociological Association. Professor Denton teaches courses in demography and urban sociology on the Albany campus of the State University of New York. Her major research interests are race and residential segregation. Her current research will extend her segregation analysis and focus on the process of actual neighborhood change in the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the country. Professor Denton received her PhD and master's degree in demography, from the University of Pennsylvania, and another advanced degree in sociology from Fordham University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Denton to Portland and to the Portland City Club.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege for me to be here today, to see you, to have an exchange with you, and to share with you some of the ideas, many of which are incorporated in my recent book, American Apartheid, and some of which I'm working on now as I continue to extend this research. Basically, the argument that American Apartheid makes is a simple one, but one that we haven't thought about for a while. That is, that when one looks at the condition of African Americans in particular, in our large urban centers in particular, and one looks at their poverty and their concentration, what during the 1980s we tended to call the underclass, that the key structural force responsible for perpetuating and maintaining African Americans in that position has been the black ghetto and has been patterns of residential housing segregation. So the argument is that segregation is the linchpin, the undermining structural force of society that maintains blacks in the lower position that they are in society today, in all too many places. Now, I say we haven't thought about this for a while, and the part that we haven't thought about is the residential segregation part. Certainly in the last 10 years, there have been no shortage of people commenting on the black underclass, commenting on the poor behavior of people who live in our public housing projects, commenting on the poverty, commenting on the income distribution. But most of those discussions did not concern themselves with patterns of neighborhood segregation, patterns of residential segregation. It is as if we assume that living in separate neighborhoods is the way it's supposed to be. It's as if it's some natural phenomenon that just happens in all of our cities and coincidentally just seemed to have happened in every single one of our cities. And my colleague and I, Doug Massey, were doing research primarily on the contemporary period, 1970, 1980. We were looking at patterns of housing segregation in the 50 largest metropolitan areas of the US, of which Portland is one. And we were looking not just at African Americans, we were doing a comparison of the housing patterns of Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans as well. And after 10 years of research and study, what we found was an amazing consistency in the residential patterns across cities and across that limited time period. And the pattern can be summarized very simply by saying that in general, African Americans are much, much more residentially segregated than are Asians or Hispanics in contemporary cities in the US. If we look at Portland as an example, since that's where we are today, the African American Segregation Index for 1990 for Portland is 66. This is an index on a scale of 1 to 100. It says roughly that 66% of the African Americans or of the non-Hispanic whites in Portland would have to change their neighborhood of residence in order for each neighborhood in Portland to have the same percentage African American as the metropolitan area as a whole. Now, Portland has about a little over 3% of its population is African American in the metropolitan area, so we are not imposing some artificial standard of integration defined by a social scientist. We are merely saying that we would spread people around evenly and each neighborhood would look like the whole area. So 66%. That number is high, but it does say that there's still room between 66 and 100. When you look at those numbers for cities like Chicago, they're up around 88 or 90% of the people would have to move to achieve an even distribution across neighborhoods. Now, when you compare that number for Portland of 66 to the segregation numbers for Asians or Hispanics, you immediately begin to see, even here in Portland, why we focus so much on the residential patterns of African Americans. The Asian Hispanic Index is 30, the Asian Segregation Index is 30, the Hispanic Segregation Index is 27. So you have a situation where African Americans are about twice as segregated as the other groups, and the other groups represent just over 3% of the population each. So these numbers are not being driven by radically different sizes of the population. Now, this level of segregation, which is higher in the older industrial cities in the Northeast and the Midwest for African Americans, from our historical research we found was not always the case. However, it has been the case for all of the 1900s. It has been the case for all of this century. So it seems to us as though it's natural, whereas in fact, it is the result of a deliberate process whereby people in this country, particularly whites in this country, and the real estate industry, the housing industry, the banking industry, and the federal government all worked together to make sure that neighborhoods were racially separated. The turn of the century in the northern cities, as the first blacks were migrating from the south to the north, you would see blacks living side by side with other people in the city. Now, this is not to be interpreted to mean that life was easy in these cities in the north at that time. Blacks were certainly discriminated against. People didn't like them. But they had a hard time finding jobs, but they weren't residentially separated. As one comes forward through the 20th century, the big thing that happened in the 1910s and 1920s was the huge influx of immigrants from southern, central, and eastern Europe. And many of our ancestors came from the second wave of European migration. Many of these European migrants were poor, had very little money, had very little education, had very few skills, and did not speak English. They were a completely different set of Europeans from the first Northern and Western European migrants who came to the United States. And in many ways, one could think of them as being somewhat similar to the African Americans who were migrating from southern cities to northern cities. They too were poor. They did speak English. They were rural people. They didn't have very many skills. But what you can remember about both of these groups of people is that they were coming to the United States and to these northern cities looking for opportunities. They had hopes, they had dreams, they wanted to work hard, they wanted to better themselves and their families, they wanted to get ahead. However, when these groups came to northern cities, something very different happened to the African Americans compared to the Europeans. Now, people will tell you that the Europeans, when they first came here, were segregated and lived in what people sometimes call ghettos. With the exception of Jews, no European group really lived in ghettos at all, but there was some level of segregation of the Europeans, to be sure. But when we study the historical patterns, what we find is that the segregation of the Europeans was markedly different from the segregation of African Americans. And this is something that most Americans, black or white, do not realize. They do not realize how different these patterns of segregation were. And from the difference in the patterns of segregation flow other consequences. Now, one difference was that when we studied segregation of Europeans, we would have identifiable neighborhoods. Little Italy, Greek town, they would be given names that went along with their groups. These neighborhoods, to be sure, had the cultural, the social, and the institutional flavor of the group to whose name it was attached. So there were Greek businesses, Greek churches, Greek restaurants, Greek everything in Greek town. But when you looked at the people who lived there, seldom was more than 50% of the population of that neighborhood Greek. Most of those neighborhoods contained 10, 15, 20 different ethnic groups, all mixed up. Greeks dominated it, but they were not homogeneously a Greek neighborhood. When you look at black neighborhoods, however, you find that 95% of the population in these neighborhoods was black. They were all black. They were not just dominated by blacks. Second difference is that when you look at the cities that were receiving these immigrants, and you say, well, you know, there was Greek town, and there was Little Italy, and then there was the section where the blacks lived. You went out in the city and you found Italians or you found Greeks. You can take any ethnic group you want. You would find that all of the Italians did not live in Little Italy. In fact, Little Italy was home to a very small percentage of the total Italian population. Most of the Italians lived spread all over the area, but they could go to Little Italy when they wanted to. That situation was very different for blacks. Most of the blacks lived in areas that were associated with black settlement. So the black areas were 90 to 95% black, and 90 to 95% of the blacks lived in the black areas, compared to the other white European ethnic groups, where those areas tended to be about 50% of that ethnic group, and less than 50% of that ethnic group lived in those areas. A third difference in the segregation pattern at the beginning of the century for European immigrants and for African Americans is that the segregation pattern of European immigrants was related to the European population growth. As more people came from a particular country, they tended to settle near others of their country for reasons of companionship, language, support, help in getting adjusted to their new society. And so segregation with an increase in migration would go up slightly. But then if migration dies down, segregation will go down. For African Americans, that relationship is not there. Not only is it not there, but to the extent that it is there, it is in the opposite direction. Segregation for African Americans goes up much, much faster than they were migrating from the south to the north in northern cities. And when the migration ceases, segregation doesn't come down, it stays up. So when one looks at patterns of residential segregation in American cities in 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, one sees increasing segregation of African Americans. One commenter on this, worker in this area, has said that by 1940, or 1950, African Americans were about as segregated in American cities as it was possible for them to be. Now, on that index that I just described, it was above 90 in most cases. I mean, if we get it up to 100, we've got perfection, which is a little bit more than we would ever expect to find in social data. So the segregation patterns of these Europeans and blacks were very different, and they had profound implications for the later success of the group. They had profound implications because where you live determines your access to public transportation, it determines your access to jobs, it determines your access to schools, it determines your ability to build political coalitions with other people to get them to vote on a project you want, you wash my back, I'll wash your kind of thing. And so this separatism that came about in our residential neighborhoods is linked to the condition of African Americans today. Now we can ask how this happened, because it is not something that just naturally happened, and it happened in many and various ways. And the history of the 20th century is the history of this color line. In the early part of the century, a whole group of border cities in Maryland and Virginia passed actual residential apartheid laws. They decided that they would carve up their city and say blacks could only live in a certain part of it, just like the people in South Africa had done for so many years. Those laws were overturned by the US Supreme Court in 1919, so we've never had official apartheid in this country. But the tools of restrictive covenants, the tools of deed restrictions, the tools of blockbusting, and in particular, in the early part of the century, the tool of violence, helped to keep blacks in certain areas where whites wanted them to live. And I'm saying whites because at this point in the time, whites controlled most of the real estate industry. Whites controlled most of the power and most of the income in these cities. So what blacks wanted was, in a sense, a function of what whites were doing to them at this point in time. When we come through the middle of the century, we see massive changes in society. A baby boom, the end of World War II, massive suburbanization, the movement to every family having at least one automobile of its own. And yet, segregation, the residential pattern of African Americans, doesn't change at all. It hardly changes at all between 1940 and 1970. And we have to ask ourselves how that could be. Well, that could be because the involvement of the federal government in the mortgage industry through FHA mortgages allowed that certain mortgages would only be given in areas that were largely white or in areas that had high value. Black areas were always in category 4. Very little money was given to them. The suburban developments were built by people who were following the then realtor's code. It is illegal to introduce another racial group into a neighborhood. William Levitt, who was one of the most famous suburban developers in this country, said outright that he would not sell any of his houses to blacks, and didn't until people took him to court many years later. So thinking that it's somehow natural that the suburbs are all white and the cities are all black is a dramatic misreading of American history. The suburbs are all white because that is the only people that we gave mortgage money to go out there, and we built federal highways for the people to be able to get out there. The cities are black because of continuing, to this day, discrimination against blacks in the rental or the sale of housing. And this process of segregation over time has become part and parcel of what we think of as American society. Now, during the Civil Rights Movement, segregation was the last bastion of civil rights to be touched upon. The Fair Housing Act was not passed until 1968. It would not have been passed had Martin Luther King not been shot. And as a price of its passage, any of you who have studied the law know that Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois said he would get the Midwestern senators to vote for it, provided they took out all of the enforcement provisions. So we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Many Americans feel, well, this has been on the books for years now, and so we must have solved this segregation problem. However, there was not a single provision worth anything left in that law to enable it to be enforced. Now, that situation did change dramatically in 1988 when Ronald Reagan passed the amendments to the Fair Housing Law, and there are now more teeth to the law. But we have essentially wasted 25 years from the time of the first passage of the law until now by giving lip service to fair housing and not really doing anything about it. But one thing important happened during that 25 years. And that thing that happened is that the ghetto, in the last 10 years, gave birth to what we came to know as the underclass. And surely everyone in this room heard many of the debates in the 1980s about what was causing the concentration of black poverty and the concentration of horrible behaviors among poor urban blacks and to a lesser extent Puerto Ricans, particularly in large industrial cities in the Northeast and Midwest. That underclass problem, as it came to be known, attracted a lot of people who were trying to explain it. People like Charles Murray and Lawrence Mead, who blamed the welfare system for the growth of the black underclass. It gave them too much money to live on. It was too permissive in the standards of behavior that it held mothers to. It was an appealing argument, certainly one that got a lot of airtime. But blacks are not the only people who receive welfare. Whites receive welfare, Asians receive welfare, Hispanics receive welfare. We weren't talking about underclasses among those groups, only about blacks. Another theorist to explain the underclass was William Julius Wilson, who argued that it was in part a result of deindustrialization. That's true. No doubt blacks lost their jobs, maybe even in greater numbers than some other groups during deindustrialization. But everybody suffered from deindustrialization. And yet it did not seem to have the effects on other communities as it did in the black community. Another of Wilson's explanations for the underclass was the outmigration of middle-class blacks from ghetto areas to more middle-class areas. There's a debate among social scientists as to how much of that migration actually took place. Some of what he perceived as migration was really people who just got poorer and stayed in the same place, but there was no doubt some migration by middle-class blacks from these poor areas. But isn't that the American dream? Isn't that what the Italians did? When they got money, they left Little Italy and they moved out to a suburb. Isn't that what the Greeks did, what the Germans did? Everybody in this country who has tried to get ahead has equated spatial mobility with social mobility. You buy a starter home and then you wait for the value of that home to appreciate, and then you buy a slightly bigger home. The ability to move to a better neighborhood is part and parcel of what's going on here. And so these explanations for the underclass, while many of them contain some kernels of truth, and while one can certainly not deny that some of the behaviors found in the underclass are not behaviors that we would support or that people in the underclass communities support. I mean, you can't find people who think drive-by shootings, 14-year-olds having babies, and taking, crack addiction are great things for their neighborhood. These explanations for this behavior all ignore the fact that the thing that distinguishes African Americans from all the other groups is their residential segregation. If you have a group that is residentially as concentrated and as isolated and as segregated as African Americans are, and the average African American, remember, is living in neighborhoods that even today in cities like Chicago are over 90% black. If you have a group that's that isolated, then you drive up the rate of minority poverty, you, by the effects of the interaction of segregation and poverty, in effect, create this underclass. You don't need a welfare system, or you don't need outmigration, or you don't need deindustrialization to do that. The underclass will be created because you are concentrating all of the effects of a downturn in the economy in one very small physical space. And once you do that, businesses start to leave, the city starts to deprive the area of services, fires go up so that they can deprive it of more fire services, hospitals move, and generally the whole fabric of the community degenerates into what we know as underclass communities. Now, this pattern, this story, is, I think, of great importance to all Americans, because we need to begin to think about what we are going to do to combat this situation. We are in a situation here where in some of our nation's largest cities, the population is severely without hope, without any expectation that life is going to be very good for them in the future. And it is a segment of the population, to be sure. Most blacks are hardworking, as are most people of any other group. But it's a segment that's growing, and it's a segment that's being left behind. And I think that one answer to this is to begin to rethink seriously our issues of how we live residentially, how all of us live residentially. Now, what happens is we have come through this history that I've just recorded with some ideas about how neighborhoods change. We think that if a black moves into your neighborhood, the property value in that neighborhood is going to go down. That happened in the past. The recent evidence is not that that is happening to the same extent anymore. Some recent studies in Washington, D.C. show housing prices appreciating faster in integrated neighborhoods, not slower. Why do we think it happens? Why do we think that housing values go down? Because when we first started the Great Black Migration in the 50s and 60s, we had a situation where the black population was increasing, where as soon as a black moved into a neighborhood, realtors said, oh, we'll open that neighborhood up. And then they tried with scare tactics and blockbusting to get whites to move out, so that whites moved out in large numbers. By the whites moving out, you lowered demand for housing in that neighborhood, and so because white demand was lowered, housing prices fell. But all of those factors are not present with us today. Many, many neighborhoods in the US in 1990 are no longer all white. They have at least a few members of different minority groups in them. And so we are cutting back on the places where that are all white, the places where whites can flee to should they want to flee. And essentially, what we gain by thinking along these lines and by looking at our neighborhood patterns is a way of allowing everyone in this country to truly achieve the American dream. We are paying a price now by keeping a segment of the population very, very residentially isolated. We are paying a price that we'll be paying more of in the future, because the demographic projections indicate that by the year 2050, whites will just barely be a majority in this country, so that half of the country will be members of what we now consider to be, quote, minority groups. And we are paying a price in terms of the spatial isolation and the wasted years of people's lives based on these living patterns that we thought were normal, that we think are going to be disastrous if we try to change them, because we have all of this history behind us that we're not really paying attention to and that we're not really reading very well. One of the things that people like to say is that the patterns that we see now are the result of preferences, that people prefer to live this way. But I think that that too needs to be examined by us and thought about by us, what our preferences really are. If you talk to black Americans who say they would prefer not to live in white neighborhoods because there's violence, people will attack their children and make fun of their children, they don't want their house firebombed, they have tried to live in a white neighborhood and their house was firebombed, that's not really what we would normally consider a preference. Sometimes they say they'd prefer to live in a black neighborhood because they're so sick and tired of dealing with racism at work all day long. So they just have to have a neighborhood to go home to. That's not a very positive preference. When you talk to whites about what neighborhood they would prefer to live in, they say, well, they would like to have a low level of integration, but they don't want very many blacks in their neighborhood. And so you ask why, and they say, well, because my housing values will fall. I mean, there's just a wealth of misinformation about this question that I think we need to begin to face up to. We need to begin to really assess, and we need to begin to try to encourage the development of integrated neighborhoods, of multicultural neighborhoods, not discourage them as we have for so much of the history of our country. And in closing, I think we should also remember that this is about essential liberties and essential freedoms. It's the piece of civil rights legislation that has not yet been done, that has not yet been covered. It is not so much about whether African Americans want to live with whites. Some do, some don't. There's a whole range of opinions in the African American community out there. And it's not about whether whites want to live with African Americans, because there is a whole range of opinions on that as well. And it's not about whether integration is a desirable social goal, although I would certainly be prepared to stand and argue with you that I think it is a desirable social goal. Reasonable people differ. People may not think it's a desirable social goal. But what this is really about is how these fundamental restrictions on individual liberty, on the liberty to live wherever you want to and wherever you can afford to, are undermining the social and economic well-being of individuals, are undermining the social and economic well-being of us, and are leading to some of our other severe urban problems. I thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today.
Thank you, Professor Denton, for a highly instructive tour of American history and for the challenging questions you present. Now our first question will be from Pete Heuser, member of the board.
Thank you for your thoughts, Dr. Denton. We haven't seen for many years, I think, the racial deed restrictions you referred to. We haven't, at least in Portland, seen violence against blacks that might move into a predominantly white area. You mentioned that in 1988 the enforcement provisions were added to the Fair Housing Act, but maybe I'm missing it, but since '88 or even before that, I haven't seen integration actually taking place. What can we do? What can our legislators do? What can or should the federal government be doing to encourage integration into areas that have been primarily not black?
You're certainly correct in that the instances of violence and the deed restrictions in many cities, and Portland is fortunate to be among them, do tend to be something of the past. Violence is not a thing of the past in many cities, however, and particularly some of the more segregated cities on the East Coast, so you should consider yourselves fortunate in that. I think that there are a number of reasons why integration has not been taking place. One is that we aren't really working toward it. We think that the situation that we're in is somehow normal. Another is that the forces that are maintaining segregation right now are extremely subtle. They are what Gary Orfield, who studies school desegregation cases, has called discrimination with a smile. So we no longer tell people they can't live in a particular area, but what we tell them is there's no housing available. Or we tell them, no, that apartment was just rented. Or we tell them, well, you know, you don't quite have enough money for a down payment on that house. Or the bank will turn down their application for a loan. Or the insurance agent will turn down their application for homeowners insurance, without which you can't get a mortgage. And the subtlety of the discrimination is found in every single study that we do. There was a national study done in 1988 by the Urban Institute that said that in the housing market, both in sales and in rentals, for both blacks and Hispanics, on average, they were discriminated against, compared to non-Hispanic whites, about half the time. So on any single real estate transaction, they only had a 50-50 chance of not being treated differently from a white. And that was in 1988, and those are national estimates. It was a sample aimed at being reflective of the whole country. So no doubt some of that is going on in cities like Portland today. The government's involvement at all levels, but particularly the federal level, is one of the key arguments that we make in American apartheid. Because the federal government, by and large, enormously helped to create this problem, and they also need to be involved in the solution for one reason. And that reason is that they are large, and what they say will apply uniformly across the entire country, or if it were state government, across the entire state. So one thing that they're working on at HUD now, I think, is they're particularly interested in mortgage discrimination. Now, mortgage discrimination, bankers may tell you that they don't actively discriminate against blacks, and sometimes that's true. But what we find is it's the letter of the mortgage law that's enforced against blacks, and whites get the benefit of the doubt. So whites get a little bit of help to get their credit history together, and blacks don't. It's not strictly discrimination, but it has a discriminatory effect. Another thing that happens is banks will have minimum loan requirements. And you had a case like that here in Portland recently, where a white couple wanted to buy a home in a black neighborhood. They were qualified, or an integrated neighborhood, they were qualified for a $100,000 loan. But the house only cost $15,000, and the bank said it wouldn't loan them that little money. So they couldn't get a mortgage because it was an integrated neighborhood. And so these are the kinds of ways that segregation is enforced. One thing the federal government could do is refuse to buy back secondary mortgages if the bank has been found to be discriminating. That would change bankers' behavior very quickly. And it would apply across the country in the same way that when the federal government said, you shall not introduce any different kind of race into a neighborhood, everybody's behavior went along with that as well. So I think that, there's room for work on this question at all levels, but the more important thing is that we not think the problem has been solved, and also that we not let acts of discrimination that we witness go unchallenged. And I think that this is an important issue because I feel that many, many whites will witness acts of discrimination or will be aware of acts of discrimination because realtors feel that they can talk to them. So they can say, oh, well, you don't want to live there because there's too many blacks. That's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. That person can be sued for saying that. And they don't say it that overtly to whites, but they can be sued, or to blacks, but they do say it to whites, and they can at least be challenged, if not reported to your local fair housing agency.
Buzz Marin, have a question for us? If not, we'll take questions from the floor.
My name is Robert Liberty. I'm a City Club member. Representative Myron Orfield, who's Gary Orfield's brother, is a great admirer of yours, Dr. Denton, and told me that if I read one book this year, it ought to be American Apartheid.
Thank you.
Myron is conducting research on circumstances in the Portland Metropolitan area on economic segregation. And I'm sure you've heard his recommendations for changing residential segregation through the different techniques, including having a strong regional government and a regional framework for assuring fair housing and property tax-based sharing. I wondered if you would comment on his recommendations for addressing these issues, whether you think they are effective or what needs to be added or changed in his prescriptions.
From what I remember of reading about Myron Orfield's recommendations, I agreed with them. I think that his emphasis, and his brother Gary has the same emphasis for schools, on a metropolitan-wide approach is important. We keep trying to persuade ourselves that we don't need the cities anymore, that the suburbs really contain everything that we need. And particularly on the East Coast, people will say, well, I haven't gone into the city in years. Well, that may be true. But if we're really honest, we have to admit that our suburbs couldn't be our suburbs without that city being there. Even if we don't personally go partake of it, that city gives something to the business community that we are working for out in the suburbs where we're living. The recommendations for how you go about changing this have to involve, in my opinion, several different facets simultaneously. You have to involve government, but you also have to worry about schools, and you have to worry about housing all at the same time. And that, making those linkages, I think, is going to be the key to putting together a policy where we might see some change in segregation levels. Cities like Portland, I think, have a wonderful opportunity because your population group of minorities, 3% black, 3.6% Hispanic, 3.5% Asian or something, are so small that it's a much more manageable size problem than looking at the problem of some of the cities like Detroit or Chicago when they think about what they're going to do.
I'm Joe Nadal, a member. When you mentioned the difference between the persistent segregation in the case of Afro-Americans who came to this country or any place, compared with, say, whites, or compared with Europeans that came, I immediately wondered, have there been exceptions to this, even a few exceptions to it? It has seemed to me strange that there would be none. And if so, have they been studied and the factors isolated that made the difference?
Exceptions among the European groups that remained that segregated? I'm not sure I followed that. I'm sorry, sir.
As time went on, I understood you to say that whereas the blacks might be in a segregated area, ghetto, whatever you want to call it, that it continued. It might even get worse. That when the Europeans came over, they might be in a section where they're pretty well segregated to begin with. But as time went on, that became less and less and less segregated. Now, if that's the case, I'd like to know the reasons and if there are any exceptions to it. Are there cases where the blacks became less segregated as time went on, instead of more segregated as time went on? If so, if there's even one or two of those situations, it seemed to me to be worthy of very careful study to see why. The very thing you're advocating is to do away with some of the segregation. Well, if this has been successfully done in some of these places, it'd be interesting to study why it worked and how it worked.
Right, that's a very good point. In none of the large metropolitan areas has black segregation really declined much, and it has remained very, very high. In some of the smaller metropolitan areas in the South and the West, with smaller black populations, newer metropolitan areas, we see greater declines in segregation, but it still remains very high for blacks. So one of the forces that we know is affecting it is the metropolitan structure of the city. If you look at a city like New York or Philadelphia or Boston, it's a center city hemmed in by many, many little municipal governments that are all crowded right in there, that all have their piece of the land. Where you have cities like Houston or Dallas, their suburbs tend by and large to be part of the city almost. They sometimes incorporate them into it. So the governmental structure does affect particularly center city suburban segregation as well. Now, there aren't any case studies where segregation declined for the black population as a whole. The segregation is a population-based measure. Obviously, there are individual cases of blacks who don't live in segregated communities. There are, however, some examples in cities of integrated communities, and I think you're right in saying that we need to pay more attention to these communities. We need to give them more importance than we have in the past. Oak Park, Illinois has deliberately maintained an integrated community for many years. So has Shaker Heights in Ohio. Those are the two best examples of those kinds of communities. But I think that part of the research agenda for the coming years should be to single out some more of these and really make a big deal of them. And I think we're beginning to see some of that in some of our cities in areas that have gentrified, like Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where people are beginning to exalt the benefits of being in that kind of an integrated community. Although gentrification, in terms of race and class segregation, carries with it its own set of problems if it winds up displacing all of the poor people. Yes, sir?
I'm Jack Butler, a member of the club. I have as my guest today Herman Washington, who is co-chairman of the Portland Public Schools. task force on multicultural, multi-ethnic education. Would it be okay to defer to him to ask my question? Herman Washington? All right.
Thank you, Dr. Butler and Dr. Denton. I enjoyed your presentation quite a great deal. It crystallizes some things that I teach in a community college course here. Most people do not understand institutionalized racism. Consequently, they feel separated from things that occur. I'm not a public policy maker. I'm not a member of the government. I'm not a banker. So people feel that there's nothing that I can do to change things. My question is, what would you suggest that each person in this room ought to be bound to if he or she truly wants to see a change in the apartheid situation in this country and in this city? And believe it or not, with the small numbers we have, there is a great deal of it here.
Thank you. I think that's a very good question, and I get asked it a lot, and I wish I had some magic answer that everyone could go do once, because I think that there are a lot of people who would be willing to do something once or twice. But unfortunately, I think it's going to require constant vigilance on our parts. One thing I think is that we have to speak out in every forum that we can about the value of integration and the value of integrated neighborhoods. All of us at some points in our lives participate in real estate transactions, some of us more than others. You're free to live wherever you want to live as whites, but you could at least ask the realtor, what about integrated neighborhoods? Are there any blacks there? Try to change the perception that you would never consider it, even if that ultimately doesn't come about being where you want to live in the first place. The other thing is to certainly write to and call your state and local national Congress people. Argue in support of bills that would promote housing integration, bills that would promote housing as a right as opposed to a privilege. Because I think that we look at the country, we say there's 300,000 homeless people, what are we going to do? Should we build homeless shelters? And we're not backing up far enough to realize that part of the reason there's so many homeless is because we stopped building public housing, because we told cities they couldn't build public housing in the segregated way that they were building it, so they declined to build any more of it. And as the income distribution gets more and more unequal in this country, we are creating problems that come out as being homeless, but they are really fundamentally problems of how are we going to live and form community in our neighborhoods. And I guess the last thing that we could all do in this room is just to simply not regard the problem as solved. Remember that this problem is there and that we can't keep talking about it as if it's gone or as if it's going to go away. Sorry, I wish that could be more.
We have time for one more question.
Dr. Denton, my name is Monroe Sweetland. I'm a member of the Portland City Club. First, just a brief comment on a related subject and then my question. I think the military policy of integration has demonstrated that Americans will accept and work with and succeed with a very high degree of integration. Not that it's perfect, but in many of our military communities all over the United States, not just a few, but hundreds of thousands of blacks and whites and all races have been integrated into residential communities under military sponsorship, which means federal policy. Now, I'd like to hear your comment on that point because it's been touched on in this otherwise rather bleak spectacle of what's been going on. My question is this. Some American conservatives, a small and deserving and even sometimes courageous minority, led by former Federal Housing Commissioner Kemp, who was formerly Republican congressman, conservative from upstate New York, have advanced the enterprise zones as an answer to this complicated problem that you've discussed. I know I'm familiar with some of the criticisms of that proposal, but does that, supposing that that were adopted as policy by, say, the Republican Party, with at least a temporary majority in both houses, does this hold some hope of substantial progress toward housing integration?
Thank you. First of all, your comment on the military is absolutely correct. That is one of the key examples of how integration will be accepted, and cities with large military installations have lower segregation scores, not only because of the military. We actually throw out military base housing from our studies because that's an artificial living arrangement, just as we throw out Native American reservations because that's, again, an artificial imposed regulation. But the military is a good example. The proposal of enterprise zones, you ask if it will do anything to improve racial integration. It could, long term, if the enterprise zones meant that the people living in them and getting jobs in them were able to work their way up, perhaps over a generation, to a higher paying job, and thus would be eligible to move to a better neighborhood. Enterprise zones are very controversial for many reasons. One, because they tend to be thought of as keeping the poor in the neighborhoods where they are and sort of keeping this concentration of race and poverty intact. And so they get attacked as gilding of the ghetto sometimes. But I've heard Theodore Shore, who is the Associate Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, speak several times, and most recently he and I were on a panel together last week. And he makes one telling point, which is that after 50 or 100 years of forcing people to live in a particular area of a city because of our racism and because of our policies of segregation, we really at this point cannot now say, okay, we've decided to be integrated, so you all have to move. We have a responsibility to those people who want to stay in the city and stay in these communities to do something for them, as well as a responsibility to enforce fair housing laws so that we have the openness and fairness and that we might see some gradual integration. So in that sense, I think there is a place for enterprise zones, as long as it's not the only approach to what we're trying to do for this issue, because ultimately, enterprise zones by themselves would only keep us separate. And I think the long-term goal would be that we would relate to each other as equals and as people who are of different colors and different cultures, but as people who were getting along, building things together, helping to try to create an American community. Someone was explaining to me on my way in that some of our guests here today are students from local schools, high schools, middle schools, who are going through this process of learning to work on projects with people who are different from themselves, and they're getting ready to graduate now. So I'm pleased to welcome you to this luncheon today, and I'm very glad that you came to hear me speak. I think we're out of time.
Thank you very much. Again, it was a pleasure to have you with us, and we thank the Issues Committee who brought your program to us. We're adjourned. Thank you.